52%. A razor-thin margin was all it took to trigger the most massive and destructive geopolitical experiment of our time. 10 years ago, the UK literally rage-quit the European Union, promising its citizens the moon and the stars, hundreds of millions in saved pounds, and a grand return to its status as a fierce, independent empire. But what if I told you that, today, the country that once ruled half the globe is suffering from an epic national hangover? How did a master plan meant to free London from Brussels' dictation turn into a colossal financial sinkhole, leaving the absolute majority of Brits desperately wanting to turn back the clock and rejoin the EU? Why did the much-hyped Brexit, the holy grail of the elites, de facto crash and burn, morphing from a historic triumph into a spectacular economic trap of their own making? And what do the people actually want now that they've suddenly realized they were sold a one-way ticket?
In this episode, we're going to dissect the anatomy of the 21st century's greatest political self-deception. Grab your tea, get comfortable, and let's dive in. The entire concept of Brexit was built around three main grievances. Britain no longer controls its own laws. It can't manage migration, and it's bleeding money just to be in the EU. The Leave camp promised to fix it all in one fell swoop, simply take back control. But to understand why this battle cry worked so flawlessly, we need to rewind to the very beginning of London's relationship with a united Europe. World War II is over. Europe lies in ruins. A grand idea emerges. Merge sworn enemies into a single economic bloc so they never start a war again. But there was one country that wanted to be with Europe, but absolutely not a part of it. And to be fair, you can kind of understand their arrogance. At the time, London was still the capital of a massive empire. The British elites were still nursing their imperial hangover. They honestly couldn't wrap their heads around it. Why shackle our economy to neighbors who had just been bombed back to the Stone Age? Fast forward just 10 years, and reality hits London like a freight train. It turned out that while the Brits were busy wallowing in their imperial past, Europe was rapidly building the future. Just look at this chart. It shows Britain's sluggish economic growth from 1950 to 1973, juxtaposed with the explosive rise of other European nations. Pumped full of American billions from the Marshall Plan, the European market started booming. And that's when London swallowed its pride and knocked on the door of the European Club. All right, guys, let us in. But Europe coldly slammed the door right in their faces. Twice, actually. Just let the sheer scale of that historical irony sink in. When they were begged to join, they arrogantly refused. When they finally came crawling back, they were shown the exit. It's the perfect metaphor for their half-century-long toxic relationship. It wasn't until 1973, after French President de Gaulle stepped down, that Britain was finally, reluctantly, let into the European family. And do you know what London did when Europe's creaky door finally opened? You won't believe it. The very first thing they did was get cold feet. Not even 2 years later, the country announced a referendum to leave. Yes, you heard that right. It's 1975. They literally just walked in and they already want out. It all came down to some shocking math. The Brits suddenly realized they were dumping colossal sums into the shared European pot, only to get pennies on the dollar in return. Enter the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. In 1984, she literally slammed her fist on the table, demanded Britain's money back, and pulled off the impossible. Europe agreed to a permanent budget rebate, compensating London for 66% of the difference between its contributions and receipts. Britain stayed in the club, but cynically haggled a VIP status for itself. Fast forward to the 90s, and the rules of the game change drastically. Europe decides that merely trading is thinking too small. The Maastricht Treaty is signed, and the word economic quietly vanishes from the community's name. It's now the European Union. Brussels wants to micromanage everything: foreign policy, security, even the exact size and curvature of the bananas on supermarket shelves. And even though London signed these papers through gritted teeth, it once again carved out unique, borderline arrogant exceptions. The UK became the weirdest hybrid in the EU. It sat right in the middle of a massive single market, but flat out refused to adopt the euro. It completely bypassed the Schengen area, kept its rebates, and constantly demanded new loopholes. The elites were thrilled. This clever little hack seemed flawless, but it didn't last long. In 2004, Europe threw its doors open to 10 new states at once. Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and the Baltic nations. And this is exactly where London made the fatal blunder that they'd try to patch years later with Brexit. Under EU rules, the old members had every right to temporarily lock their labor markets against their new neighbors. Germany and France coldly did exactly that. Sorry, our own jobs come first. But Britain decided to play the open-minded good guy. Why? Because government analysts, looking smart while shuffling their charts, issued a highly comforting forecast. Don't worry, we'll see a maximum of 13,000 to 15,000 people a year. Do you know how incredibly wrong they were? Over the next decade, 1.5 million people crossed the UK border. And there it was, the third highly explosive issue, migration. One fine morning, millions of ordinary Brits woke up with the chilling realization that they had entirely and irreversibly lost control over their own borders. The new Prime Minister, David Cameron, found himself in an absolute political dead end. He had publicly sworn to the British people to cut migration down to 100,000 people a year. But with the EU's open borders, pulling that off was physically impossible. Riding this massive wave of public anger, UKIP, the UK Independence Party, started gaining serious traction. They aggressively demanded an exit from the EU and ruthlessly cannibalized the ruling Conservatives' voter base. The sheer scale of the looming disaster became crystal clear a bit later when UKIP took first place in the 2014 European Parliament elections. For the first time in over a century, a nationwide UK election wasn't won by either the Tories or Labour. But even back in 2013, feeling the ground shifting under his feet, Cameron decided to pull a sneaky maneuver to stop the bleeding. He stepped up to the podium and slapped Europe with a harsh ultimatum. Britain joined this club for trade, not to be swallowed up by a single European superstate. Stop shoving your laws down our throats, stripping our parliament of its power, and burning through our cash. But you know what the ultimate, paradoxical irony of this historic speech was? Cameron himself was dead set against leaving the EU. For him, all this tough talk was nothing but a brilliant political bluff. He threw the voters a bone by promising a referendum, simply as a cheat code to win the election. He was absolutely certain the parliament would end up hung again, forcing him to build a coalition, which meant he could quietly kill this dangerous promise in backroom deals. But he miscalculated, fatally. The idea of a referendum fired up the public so much that the Conservatives won a clear, absolute majority. That surprise victory snapped the trap shut. The Prime Minister had zero room left to maneuver. He was forced to actually deliver on his own promise. And this is where things get really interesting. The country split right down the middle, the Leave camp versus the Remain camp. According to all the initial forecasts, the pro-EU side was supposed to win by a landslide. So how on earth did they manage to fail so spectacularly? It's simple. The Remainers brought a calculator to a gunfight. They droned on and on about GDP drops, spouted complex data, and paraded a bunch of stuffy experts in front of the cameras. Essentially, their entire campaign boiled down to, let's just keep things as they are, otherwise it's going to get worse. But the people were desperately craving a system reboot. And that change was sold to them like an absolute masterclass in marketing. The Brexiteers threw logic out the window. They aimed straight for the gut. They rolled out a brilliant catch-all slogan that solved everything. Take back control. Sick of foreign laws? Take back control. Tired of our money leaving the country? Take back control. Too many migrants? Take back control. They played hard and dirty. The infamous Red Bus toured the entire country, plastered with the claim, "We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead." The number was pulled entirely out of thin air, but it permanently hardwired itself into the voters' brains. The night of June 24, 2016, went down in history as the most intense political thriller ever broadcast live. Over in the City of London, bankers were already popping champagne. The markets, the bookies, and the exit polls were 100% convinced Britain wasn't going anywhere. But then the clock struck midnight, and the screens started flashing data from the forgotten, rusting industrial towns up north. Sunderland, Newcastle. The numbers rolling in made capital city analysts choke on their coffee. This wasn't just a vote. This was a furious, blind revolt by the working class, a demographic the London elites had stubbornly ignored for decades. The country literally ripped at the seams. The youth voted overwhelmingly for Europe, while the 60-plus generation ruthlessly checked the box to leave, essentially deciding their grandchildren's future. Voter turnout smashed historic records, and the Brexiteers snatched the victory with 52%. By the next morning, under a grey London sky, a pale David Cameron stepped in front of the press and announced his resignation. The political poker game that started as a clever bluff had escalated into a national catastrophe. Britain woke up on a completely different planet, but this was only the beginning. Britain had just pulled the trigger on the biggest political overhaul in decades, without so much as a rough blueprint in hand. The country literally had no manual on how to surgically detach one of the world's most powerful economies from the continent. No one in history had ever tried to untangle a knot like this. How are the freight trucks going to move now? What's the deal with visas? How is customs even supposed to function? The impossible job of clearing this rubble was handed to Theresa May, a politician who had personally voted against Brexit. At this point, UK politics started looking like a surreal sitcom. London naively expected Europe to get spooked and quickly dish out concessions. But Brussels had its own cold-blooded calculus. If we let Britain leave on easy mode, the rest of the bloc will be lining up at the exit tomorrow. So, Europe went into full lockdown mode, zero compromises. And soon enough, they hit a massive glitch in the matrix. Its name was Northern Ireland. It's the only place where the UK shares a physical land border with the EU, and it was a literal puzzle with no solution.
Look at the board. If you throw up a hard border with checkpoints and barbed wire, you risk reigniting a bloody civil war that had only just ended. If you draw the border down the Irish Sea, cutting Northern Ireland off from the rest of Britain, you're single-handedly jump-starting the collapse of the United Kingdom. And if you just leave everything as is, with no borders at all, then functionally, Brexit never even happened. For 3 years, Theresa May repeatedly smashed her head against this wall, desperately trying to find a middle ground. In the end, she suffered the most crushing parliamentary defeat in British history, and, swallowing her tears in front of the cameras, resigned forever. After 3 years of agonizing, tiptoeing negotiations, Britain decided to swap out the exhausted surgeon for a guy with a sledgehammer, Boris Johnson. A man who, from day one, had been aggressively pushing for the hardest, most uncompromising Brexit possible. To slice through the Irish Gordian knot, Johnson did what no one else dared to do.
He coldly drew a customs border right down the sea, de facto amputating Northern Ireland from the rest of the country. He managed to force this radical patch through, not because it was a genius move, but because, after 3 years of sheer political paranoia, the nation was so burned out that people were literally screaming, "Just do something, anything, just get it over with." On January 31st, 2020, the UK officially stopped being an EU member. The hardliners won, locking in the most radical, painful breakup imaginable. It's been over 5 years since that day. The dust has settled. The emotions have cooled off. Now, it's time to check the receipts. Let's look at the cold, hard facts and see what actually happened to the 3 core problems that made the Brits tear down their familiar world with their own bare hands. So, Britain broke free, threw off the shackles, took back control. Sounds epic, right? But let's see how this political fairy tale shattered against the brutal wall of macroeconomics.
Problem number 1, independence. They wanted to write their own laws. On paper, sure, Brussels isn't their boss anymore. But here's the harsh reality check. Europe remained their #1 trading partner. Just look at this chart. Nearly half of all their exports and imports are tied to the EU. And to sell even a single bolt or a block of cheese over there, British factories still have to fully comply with European standards. The only difference is that London used to sit at the head of the table and dictate those rules. Now, they're just passengers in the back seat, obediently following what others have decided. And let's not forget the absolute absurdity with Northern Ireland. To avoid sparking a new war on the island, London had to set up a customs border, right inside its own sovereign territory. Just picture this. Goods travel from England to British Belfast, and they get inspected at the border as if they were entering a foreign country. Problem number 2, the economy. The ultimate Brexit selling point was, we'll stop feeding Europe and finally live like kings. The result? They stopped paying membership fees, sure, but all that extra cash didn't magically spawn out of thin air. Just look at this graph. No complex pyramid schemes or convoluted stats, just one clear, solid line tracking the economic growth of the world's major players. Before the referendum,
Britain was running neck and neck with the pack. But immediately after, that line brutally snaps and nosedives, lagging behind its neighbors by a staggering 6%. But the most vicious irony of all hit with the third problem: migration. This was the Leave campaign's absolute trump card. A year before the referendum, 250,000 people moved to the country. The Brits were screaming, "This is a disaster, we're suffocating." Do you know what the numbers are today? 900,000 people a year, almost a million. How did this happen? Basic laws of the market.
The Europeans, those very builders, nurses, and truck drivers, packed their bags and bounced. But somebody still has to do the work. The country bailed on the EU right on the eve of the pandemic, and hospitals were choking from staff shortages. In sheer panic, the government started handing out visas left and right to citizens of India, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the Philippines. Universities, suddenly cut off from fat European grants, opened their doors wide to international students from all over the globe, who brought their entire families along for the ride. 10 years later, we're looking at a mind-blowing picture. The country walked through political hell, burned through multiple prime ministers, wasted billions, and ended up exactly back where it tried to escape from. You can confidently say that Brexit didn't fix a single problem. It's no wonder that today, 58% of Brits openly call it a historic mistake. Run the referendum tomorrow, and 62% would vote to jump right back into the EU.
British history is a perpetual pendulum, a harsh, pragmatic swing between imperial hubris and cold economic calculus. And by the looks of it, their national pride came with an exorbitant price tag. The pendulum has swung back. So, what's your take? Will Britain actually pull the trigger, roll back the clock, and return to the European Union? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next episodes.